All right, it's time to start my handy dandy character worksheet. Woohoo! All right, question 1, name. I got it. Question 2, age. I know this one. Question 3, oh, what's her favorite cereal? Well, she lived in 1837. I don't think they had cereal then. Spider-Man versus Batman. Who would win in a fight? I'm sorry, are those different people? What inspires her? Inspires her to do what? Hey there, I'm Nicole. Welcome back to my channel. I am a writer and story nerd. This video is going to be 5 tips for characters. So obviously in Preptober, we're trying to get everything that we need together to be able to do NaNoWriMo. And I think that a huge part of planning your story is getting to know your characters. I hate character info sheets, character questionnaires, character whatever I just showed you over there. They have never worked for me. I guess they're fun to do, but then I never ever use the stuff that I come up with in the story. So if you do not like character sheets, these 5 tips are for you. Let's jump right into it. My first tip is determine the functions that you need first. So you obviously need a main character. They need an opponent, a main opponent. They might need some secondary opponents. They need allies. They need mentors. You need potentially a subplot character. Also, there are archetypes that I like of fake ally opponent, so someone that you think is an ally but is actually an opponent, and fake opponent allies who you think is opposing you but they're actually an ally. And then of course, just write down the kinds of characters that you want to have that are specific to your story. So if it's YA, you might need them to have parents or teachers. If it's a story about someone who works somewhere, they need a boss, maybe they need neighbors. In my story, I needed actors, people to play parts in a play. So I would just list all of those functions that you need so you have an idea of the cast. This should be in tech, it would be minimum viable product, but we're gonna call this your minimum viable cast. Who do you need to be in this story? What are their roles? What are their functions? My number 1 pet peeve is when there are too many characters that don't seem to serve different functions, because I am very bad personally at distinguishing between characters. One thing that will make me drop a book is if I cannot figure out who these darn characters are. So you don't want to have too many characters. Figure out your minimum viable character list. And let's move on to tip number 2, which is for your main character, focus on a cluster of details or ideas. So for me, and this is just how I think about character, you probably think about it differently. I do think of characters as kind of like 3 or 4 ideas put together. So for example, with Hermione Granger from Harry Potter, I have a couple examples here. She's this typical know-it-all, bookish, super intelligent girl, and then you have this rule-following aspect to her with a bit of bossiness, and then you have this super loyal, brave aspect to her as well. Now we're putting this super smart, rule-following girl into this adventure book where we're breaking the rules. Jo March, you have someone who's kind of tomboyish and rejects the role of females in the 1860s. And she's also a writer. She has huge ambitions, but she has a fierce love of her family and of Beth. And you have those ideas together and you can see synergies and contradictions between them. Having those ideas in my head of, okay, these 3 things that I know that I've seen before that I'm combining together works a lot better for me than filling out a character profile on all the little details about them. It just gives me a better sense of who they are. Another thing that I like to do are Enneagrams. So if you want to search, there's 8 Enneagram types. What I like about them is that they have 8 levels for each Enneagram. And so there's kind of you at your best self, and then there's the shadow. So even when you're choosing opponents and stuff, I find it very helpful to go to the Enneagrams and say, okay, I think that this person would be a helper. The shadow of a helper is someone who's like super manipulative and gets really jealous and really angry when their help is not reciprocated. And that's an interesting idea for a character as well. So combining an Enneagram type with a few of those more concrete ideas is also a way that I like to define or brush stroke my characters. My number 3 tip is your main character, if they have a weakness, and in some stories like the James Bond stories or whatever, he doesn't have a weakness, he doesn't need those, he doesn't need to change. But if you're doing a story where the character does change, your character's weakness should be tied to their character arc and also to the story. But for a really long time, I didn't get this. I thought it could be like, my character's weakness is she's afraid of spiders. And then she just, runs off to fulfill the prophecy. And it's like, how did those things relate? They don't relate. They should connect. So I learned this through both the Anatomy of Story, which has a weakness action change model of describing character action, and then story grid genre, which if you look at the internal genres, and I'll link the article to that below, their definitions of internal genres are basically different archetypes or scaffolds of weakness action change. For example, the story grid status genre, a weakness for the character in that could be the character is not very good at X. They are insecure and unconfident. Their action is they compete in some sort of event or competition where they have to use X, and then the change is they either succeed in X, increasing their status, or they don't win, but they become confident in their abilities anyways through competing in action. Thus, instead of being insecure, not good at X, and unconfident, they might still be not good at X, but they're secure and confident, or something of the sort. Another one, this is the story grid morality genre. The morality genre example, so you could start in the beginning with a character whose weakness is they're ambitious and selfish, they neglect their family and friends, they only look out for number one. An action is that gets challenged, so they're forced perhaps to accept responsibility within their family or for their friends. A really good example is Kramer versus Kramer, where there's a dad who is never at home, very selfish, not focused on his family at all. His wife leaves him and he's forced to care for their son. That is the action. And then the change for this type of character could either go, it can go one way or the other. They can descend deeper into selfishness and cynicism and neglectfulness. Or the change could be they sacrifice what they want for their family, or they sacrifice something. The summary of that one is your main character's weakness should be connected to their character arc. All right. My tip number 4, when you're figuring out your opponents and your allies and all of that stuff, connect it back to the main character. So I always ask when I'm thinking of opponents, who would provide conflict for my main character? Who would attack or who would challenge my main character given their weaknesses that they have? So if I have a selfish character, I want one of my opponents to either be someone who is entirely selfless and loving, or someone who can really target that selfishness and ask them to do more and more. Continuing. If I have a character of low status, I might want a character of high status or of high ability to be their opponent. It's interesting how you can give your supporting characters, anyone basically other than the main character, strengths and weaknesses based on how those will synergize and interact with your main character's strengths and weaknesses. So think about that. And then tip number 5 is define the characters in relation to each other. So my favorite thing to do is make a chart. So this is what I have for Project Musical. So I have my main characters up at the top. So I have my main character, I have 3 opponents, and then I have her ally on this side. And it's a chart. So for all of them, I listed their weakness and need, desire, their values, power, status, ability, and then their moral problem variation. So for example, the moral problem is really about how do you increase your status. and still be authentic. So for the main character, it's she becomes a director to make her comeback. The main opponent wants to prove he's not just kind of like a class clown by winning the competition, he sells his soul to do it. Another opponent, she's worried her status will be, she is a very high status, but is worried that the place she is in will wreck her status and bring her down. Therefore, she's super determined to win. Another character relies on other people, like her friends, to give her her status, and she becomes super angry when that status or those friendships don't work out. And then another character doesn't give a crap about their status. And there's a whole bunch of different variations, and I tried to do it with supporting characters as well, although not as strict in this chart. But I think it's helpful to lay things out all in like one spread so I can really see. And then what you want to do is try to push characters to the corners as much as appropriate for your writing. You know, if you have a character who values authenticity, you want to have another character who values their image. And those things could conflict or they could not conflict. They're not opposites of each other, but if you have someone who values their image more than being authentic, they will choose being non-authentic to improve their image. Anyways, those were my 5 tips. Start with the functions, focus on clusters of details or like broad brush strokes. Your main character's weakness should connect to their character arc if they have one. Who would provide the most conflict for your main character based on their weaknesses and strengths, and define the characters in relation to each other, pushing them to the corners so they are as different as possible and offer not only just differences in personalities, but archetypes of different ways to approach living. Ooh, deep. Fun. Okay. I would love to hear about how you define your characters. What kind of character prep work do you do before you start writing? Is that included in your Preptober? How's your Preptober going? What's the progress bar like? Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you check out those links below, and I will see you next time.